The world of Veridai was silent now, where once its skies had screamed with fire. It was not silence born of peace, but the heavy, choking hush of aftermath, where the wind carried no birdsong, only the rustle of soot-scattered grass and broken steel, half buried beneath scorched soil. Queen Alcera stood alone on a hill of white stone and ash, a mourning veil woven from threads of her people's mourning, draped across her slender shoulders, its black length curling in the breeze like tendrils of grief made visible. Beneath her feet, at the crest of a low, uneven rise where the old starlight still reached, lay a single grave, marked not by ceremony, but by the shattered remains of a ceremonial circlet, burnt, twisted, half-melted. It had once belonged to her niece. The child had only seen 4 cycles, barely past the first flowering of her scales, her voice still high and innocent, her laughter the only sound that could calm Alcera's storm-bound heart. They said she had perished in the evacuation, her body vaporized in the collapsing corridor of the Sky Shrine when the Terran missiles struck. They said her remains were unrecoverable, that no formal rite could be performed. And so the grave was only symbolic, a cairn for the Queen's pain, not her kin. But Alcera came nonetheless, year after year, crossing battle-worn territories and orbital wreckage fields without escort, without announcement, as if each pilgrimage might somehow undo the lie of that moment. Her claws traced the stone, leaving faint lines etched into its surface, not scratches of rage, but strokes of remembrance. She said the child's name aloud in the old tongue, the one used only for sacred vows and dirges. Seraya. The name fell like crystal breaking, pure and fragile, and then vanished beneath the wind. Her voice trembled with it. Her people had moved on, rebuilt their cities, signed accords with humans, but her grief had not followed. It remained here, anchored like a ghost to the stone. Alcera lowered herself to her knees, her robe pooling around her like a black lake under moonlight. She laid a single flower, an ash bloom, delicate and violet-veined, upon the grave. And as her eyes shut, the weight of memory crashed over her again. She had once sworn to protect the child with her life, but no vow could stop fire that fell from orbit. No crown, no title, no bloodline could shield a 4-year-old girl from the madness of war. A shadow passed overhead, a flock of drone birds scanning the region for rogue energy signatures. But Alcera didn't flinch. Her people thought her brave for enduring the loss, but she wasn't brave. She was broken. She remained because she had nothing else to offer the dead but silence. Chapter 2. The Soldier Who Stayed Behind. 3 sectors away and 2 years prior, under a crusted dome of Martian sand and classified betrayal, the girl who had died still breathed. Her name was unknown to him. He only remembered the child's wail as he dug through charred debris in the final hour of the siege. Sergeant Mark Halden, once of Terran Recon Unit 9, had broken from his company during the withdrawal, unable to stomach the idea of leaving the innocent behind. It wasn't strategy, it wasn't orders, it was the cry. The corridor had collapsed seconds later, sealing the path behind him, but by then he was already sprinting through fire with her in his arms. Her skin was scaled and blistered, her tiny claws curled around his bloodied collar, and one eye was swollen shut. She didn't speak. She only stared at him with a kind of knowing panic, too young to understand war, but old enough to know death had come for her. Mark stole a cryopod from an abandoned medbay, jury-rigged the seal using scraps from a scorched drone, and encoded a false identification. Subject A312, non-critical refugee orphan. He fled protocol. He erased his ID from the military grid. They would have hunted him for treason if they knew what he'd done. Instead, he buried himself in an off-world scrapyard on Mars, repurposing ancient tech to power the cryo unit, feeding her small doses of nutrient serum in intervals, praying over a body that might never wake. She had survived, barely, but it came at a cost. Her body fought him with fever and rejection, alien biology colliding with his crude medical patches. There were nights she convulsed until he thought she'd die in his arms. But each time, her pulse, barely audible, fluttering, came back. He named her Little Flame because the first time she moved in the pod, the motion flickered like a spark returning to dry wood. He didn't know she was royal. He didn't know her bloodline had once commanded fleets and moonborn palaces. He only knew that her life mattered. And so he stayed. While diplomats debated the war's consequences and queens wept beneath empty graves, one human soldier with cracked armor and shaking hands guarded a single heartbeat in the dark. Waiting, hoping, not for forgiveness, but for a second chance, for both of them. You said, develop only chapter 3 and 4 or make it very long and avoid bullet or highlight point. ChatGPT said, Chapter 3. Kingdom of Ash and Grief. The rebuilt halls of the Viridian citadel gleamed with sapphire light and polished obsidian, their curves inspired by the ancient rivers that once flowed beneath the twin suns of her homeland. But no river ran beneath them now. The underground aquifers had dried to dust in the final year of the Galactic War, and in their place were coolant systems and war furnaces that never stopped humming. Queen Alcera walked those halls like a phantom clothed in authority, her ceremonial silks dragging behind her like the shadow of her mourning. Her court feared her, not for her cruelty, for she had none, but for the absence of her once burning joy. The flame that had once lit the royal chambers was gone, and no diplomatic victory or alliance with Terran delegates could return it. The council tried, in their own ways. They urged her to remarry, to raise another heir. They spoke of unity, of the future, of the importance of moving on. But how could one move on when a piece of the soul had been lost in a firestorm, when a single scream had echoed across space and still hadn't stopped ringing in her ears? No ritual, no flame, no song had quieted it. Alcera had seen horrors during the war, cities turned to dust, friends ripped apart by magnetic mines, dignitaries assassinated mid-negotiation, but nothing compared to the emptiness of her niece's absence. 4 cycles old, the child had barely begun to understand her lineage, had only just started mimicking the cadence of royal speech and practicing how to address foreign dignitaries with clumsy, regal flair. And then, gone. Each year, Alcera returned to that grave site. She would remove the veil of the queen and walk as a bare-souled mourner, alone, her guards forbidden to follow. She spoke to the grave as if it could answer, asking questions that burned more than any battlefield wound. Did it hurt? Were you scared? Did you call for me? But there was never a reply, only the soft rustle of wind and the occasional static hum of a scanning drone that dared not come too close. She told no one what she saw in her dreams, that sometimes she swore she heard the girl's laughter echo through her sleep, only to wake weeping, furious at her own heart for keeping hope alive where it should have died. In the throne room, she made decisions with cold logic. She signed treaties with Earth's representatives. She approved reparations. She ordered the dismantling of forward assault fleets and converted them into peacekeeping vessels. Her name became synonymous with diplomacy and restraint. The galaxy praised her for her wisdom, her maturity, her serenity. But they never saw the way she would return to her quarters and collapse behind a sealed obsidian door, clawing at the silent air, begging gods she no longer believed in to give her back one life. Just one, so small and fierce and undeservedly taken. And the grief shaped her people. They followed her example, choosing trade over retaliation, rebuilding over revenge. The war had left deep scars, but in their queen's silence, they found direction. If their monarch, whose niece had died in the heart of the final siege, could show restraint, so could they. But what they never knew, what no one dared to guess, was that their queen's restraint was not born of moral superiority. It was born of exhaustion, the kind of grief that became a cathedral, vast and echoing, where even wrath had learned to kneel. Chapter 4. The Frozen Hope. In a rust-swept crater on Mars, beneath layers of abandoned cargo haulers and forgotten satellite wreckage, a miracle pulsed faintly in synthetic silence. Mark Halden sat cross-legged before the cryopod, wiping dust from the coolant panel, watching the monitor as it blinked soft green rhythms into the dark. The girl, his girl now, though he had no blood claim to her, remained suspended in a near-perfect stasis, a condition he had learned to maintain with tools scavenged from dead colonies and scavenger drops. He hadn't spoken to another human being in over a year. Not directly. Occasionally he picked up Terran broadcasts over shortwave, mostly garbage news and political infighting, but he avoided it. He couldn't risk the transmission of his location. Not after what he'd done. They would brand him a deserter, a traitor to the chain of command. Worse, they would take her. Some biotech corporation would find her blood, trace her genome to Royal Veridaean lines, and use her as leverage in the next interstellar negotiation. The thought alone made his fists clench around his tools. He had seen what humans were capable of when power was at stake. He'd fought in those battles. He'd watched planetary tribunals broadcast across systems like theater, each one pretending to stand for justice while war machines fueled by alien children's DNA lined the orbit of corporate planets. He would die before letting her fall into that. She had grown slightly, even in cryo, something that shouldn't have been possible. Her cells resisted stasis, fully locking in. Something about her biology burned too fiercely to freeze completely, so he adjusted the serum dosage manually, every 2 days, monitoring her vitals like a father waiting for a heartbeat. Sometimes in the stillness of the bunker, he would talk to her. He'd sit beside the pod and murmur stories about the old Earth, about the sky over Kansas before the colonies, about rivers that weren't red with iron. He told her about his sister's daughter, how she used to braid plastic grass into his helmet. He told her she had the same laugh. He told her he'd never leave. Then one night, no different than the rest, he awoke to a sharp sound, not from the comms, not from the machinery, from inside the cryopod. He rushed to her side. The frost layer on the lid was melting from within. Her eyes, one violet, one gold, were open, bleary, unfocused, frightened. Her tiny hand pressed weakly against the glass. He didn't speak. His throat locked. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he initiated the defrost sequence. Her breathing was shallow. She couldn't speak his language, but her eyes never left his face. She had survived. Somehow, against every biological and cosmic odd, she had survived the flames of war, the vacuum of abandonment, the limits of stasis. The girl the galaxy had already buried was waking up in the arms of the one man the stars had forgotten. And Mark Halden, the fugitive soldier with no rank and no home, whispered only one thing as he reached into the chamber and held her hand. "You're safe now, little flame." She woke slowly, as if rising through molasses, as if time itself resisted the return of one it had tried to erase. Her first breath outside the cryopod was sharp, ragged, and unfiltered by the cryo's sterile atmosphere, and her lungs shuddered with it, like a trapped animal startled into life. Her limbs twitched under the weighted blanket he had warmed for days in preparation, her tiny fingers curling reflexively before uncurling again, trying to remember how to feel. Her scales, once a pale lavender hue, had darkened with the passing years, now richer, more radiant like midnight silk marbled with ash. She blinked, not just in confusion, but in pain. Not physical pain alone, but the pain of remembering too much in a world that had not asked for her to return. Mark sat beside her, motionless. He didn't speak. Not yet. He'd waited so long for her to open her eyes again that now, in this moment, he dared not shatter the fragile bridge between silence and wonder. Her gaze found his, slow and searching. Her breathing slowed as if his presence was familiar, even if she could not name him. Her lips parted. A wordless sound escaped, part whimper, part question, part echo from a memory neither of them could fully grasp. Over the next few days, he didn't leave her side. He spoon-fed her warm broth and mineral-rich formula through careful drops, watching her swallow with difficulty but determination. Her voice remained a whisper, an alien syllable here, a breathless tone there. But her eyes began to speak volumes. She recognized light and shadow. She tracked movement. She listened when he spoke, sometimes tilting her head with an expression eerily similar to her old court portraits, as if a flicker of nobility lingered in her even beneath all the scars. She had survived fire. She had survived abandonment. And now, she was learning to survive life again. Mark gave her time, no questions, no pressure, only presence. When she wept in her sleep, silent tears, eyes clenched in a fear she couldn't voice, he would lay a hand gently over hers until her breath evened out. She began to sit up by the 7th day, began to eat with her own hands by the 9th. On the 10th, she found her way to the makeshift window where the Martian dusk turned the world a deep orange, and sat there for hours, simply staring. She did not smile, but she did not cry either. It wasn't until the 15th day that she spoke her first full phrase. It wasn't English. It wasn't Terran Standard. It was Veridaean, an old dialect Mark had only heard once long ago, during a brief diplomatic broadcast before the war. But the tone of it, The trembling reverence, the way her hand reached for the sky outside the dome, it was unmistakable. "Ulreth Saviralen," she whispered. He stared at her. "What did you say?" he asked softly. She turned to him, her voice cracked. "Aunt Alcera, where is she?" Mark's blood ran cold. The solar storm that day nearly buried the signal, scattering its fragments across a dozen relay satellites. But deep within the Council's relic scan archives, a forgotten piece of surveillance AI lit up, pinging a match between an old genetic flag and a living signal pulse, barely strong enough to register. The code embedded in the pulse was masked, but not well enough. A royal gene sequence had surfaced. Not just any. Her gene sequence. The one registered dead, mourned across the galactic core, enshrined in 100 temples of remembrance. The relay system hesitated, then fired a cascade alert directly into the Council's High Blood Bureau. Alcera stood frozen in her chambers, the message data still hovering before her, red lit and blurring at the edges. At first, she dismissed it as a cruel hoax, another trick, another Terran shadow game to test her composure. But then came the biometric readout. The neural rhythms, the molecular age signature, the tremble in her claw as she touched the hologram, and the pulse confirmed its sync. It was her, not her daughter, not a clone, her niece. Alive. The queen fell against the obsidian archway behind her, her breath caught between a sob and a scream. For a moment, she was no longer a sovereign, no longer a symbol, just a woman who had been dragged through years of mourning, now confronted with the impossible resurrection of the only child who had ever held her hand without fear. She didn't speak to her aides. She didn't alert the palace. She simply whispered a command, "Bring me my ship." In the Martian bunker, Mark felt the atmosphere shift. He didn't need a satellite to tell him. The girl, now whispering her real name over and over again as if trying to anchor herself in this new reality, had begun to hum. The tune was alien, but the rhythm was unmistakable. A lullaby. One that didn't come from him. One he had never taught her. And in orbit, breaking past the red planet's haze with the elegance of a blade drawn in silence, came a vessel of such refined symmetry that it cast shadows even on the satellite corpses drifting nearby. The Queen's Ark, the last ship of her personal fleet, it had not been seen since the final day of the war. Alcera did not wait for ceremony. She did not lower banners or declare her presence. She descended into the Martian night cloaked in silence, flanked by 2 guards who dared not speak. Her eyes burned like starlight over still oceans, terrified, furious, hopeful, unbelieving. And Mark, standing before the cryo hatch with a trembling child gripping his fingers, felt the weight of fate crawl across his spine like ice. The door opened. Alcera stepped forward, her breath caught in her throat. And the child, without hesitation, whispered, "Aunt Alcera," before rushing into her arms. Galactic war, diplomacy, betrayal, treaties, none of it mattered in that moment. Only the sound of an alien queen falling to her knees, clutching a child she had buried in her dreams 1,000 times. Only the eyes of a human soldier, red with exhaustion, watching them reunite and wondering if this moment would damn him or save him. For a long time, the silence held between them, not heavy, not tense, but sacred. The child clung to Alcera's chest, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around the queen's ceremonial robes, as if she feared this too was another dream from which she might wake. Alcera did not speak, could not speak. Her mouth was open, but no words came. Only her arms moved, wrapping around the child, clutching her as if time itself might try to steal her back. Her breathing broke in halts and sobs, eyes wide and weeping, her shoulders shuddering with a grief that finally cracked under the weight of impossible joy. The queen had practiced diplomacy with every empire, stood unflinching before assassins and walked through fire during the siege, but she had never prepared for this. Mark watched from the side of the room, his posture still stiff, as if expecting to be struck or arrested at any moment. His boots remained planted, dirt-streaked and unpolished, and his hands, still grease-stained from months of engineering work, remained at his sides, refusing to interrupt the scene. The Queen's guards glanced at him, but they didn't move either. They had never seen their monarch drop to her knees. Not in battle, not in council, not even during the day of surrender. But here she was, cradling a girl she had once mourned in secret beneath the stars of a dead battlefield. The Queen's crown had tilted forward, strands of her hair falling across her scaled brow, and she did not bother to fix it. The child pulled back slowly, just far enough to look up into her aunt's face. "I dreamed of you," she whispered in the alien tongue, her voice broken and hoarse, but filled with that unmistakable spark. "You used to sing when the lights went out." Alcera's jaw trembled. "You remember that?" She choked, her claw gently brushing the girl's cheek. The child nodded. "The humans were loud, but your voice was soft." Then she smiled, a crooked, tired smile, but radiant as starlight. "You kept me safe." Mark looked away then. He wasn't good with praise. He had never done this for recognition, and he never imagined it would end like this. For years he had prepared for her death, not her survival, for burial, not return. And now he stood in the presence of a queen, a miracle, and a throne of memories that wasn't his to carry. Yet here he was. Alcera slowly turned toward him, rising from her knees with the girl still in her arms. Her eyes met his, and for a heartbeat, Mark braced himself. He expected anger, retribution, accusation. He had, after all, stolen royal blood from the field of war and hidden her away without permission. But Alcera said nothing. She only stared at him with eyes that were wide with something far more dangerous than wrath. Wonder. "You saved her," she said finally, her voice like wind moving through ancient ruins, soft, reverent, and stunned. "You disobeyed every law of your people. You risked war. You buried yourself in exile, for her." Mark nodded once, not knowing what else to say. "She was alive," he murmured. That was enough. Alcera's lips parted again, her breath catching as she looked at the man who had given her back the one thing no crown could replace. "And what do you want in return?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "A reward? A title? Safe passage? Wealth?" Mark shook his head. "Nothing." "You must want something," she pressed, stepping closer. "I want her to be free," he said. "Not a weapon, not a symbol, just a kid. Just a kid who gets to live." Alcera stared at him, stunned into silence once more. Then, slowly, she nodded. And for the first time since the end of the war, the Queen of Veridai smiled. The sun was rising beyond the Martian ridge when the royal shuttle lifted them into orbit. It wasn't a military extraction, no grand announcement, no broadcasting to the council. Alcera had ordered the shuttle herself with only 3 words: no press, no spectacle. It was not the return of a princess. It was the rescue of a child. The silence of the stars welcomed them like an old friend, and the red planet below shrank slowly into history. The child, now wearing a soft silk wrap provided by the Queen's attendants, sat between them, one hand gripping Mark's and the other curled around Alcera's clawed fingers. Neither adult tried to speak much. There was too much silence, too many years, too much pain that couldn't yet be turned into words. Occasionally the child would ask a question. "Where is the ocean? Do we still have the blue fruit? Do the moons still sing at night?" And Alcera, voice barely steady, would answer each question like a lullaby. She explained that the ocean was smaller now, but healing. That yes, the blue fruit still grew, and yes, she had saved one just in case. That the moons did not sing anymore, but maybe, just maybe, they were waiting for the right voice to return. Later, when the child grew tired, she leaned her head on Alcera's shoulder and began humming. Mark recognized the tune, the same one he had heard once when the girl first woke. It was soft and lilting, with broken rhythm and halting notes, but as her voice picked up strength, the melody became clear. It was ancient, royal, a lullaby from the time before war, and it broke Alcera completely. Tears fell down her cheeks in silence. She didn't sob, didn't speak, only wept as the girl continued to hum, unaware of the raw wound she had reopened. But it wasn't the pain of mourning anymore. It was the pain of something returning. A sound she thought lost forever now lived again in the voice of a child reborn from flame. Mark leaned back in his seat, head resting against the cold steel. He watched the stars pass and wondered how long he would be allowed to remain in their orbit. He had saved her, yes, but he had also kept her from her people. Alcera could still cast him out, or worse, but in his heart he knew the truth. He would do it again, all of it. The disobedience, the hiding, the exile. He would burn his name from every database and vanish across every system if it meant keeping that girl alive. Because she wasn't just a child. She was hope. Tangible, stubborn, wild, and warm. And when the Queen leaned across the aisle, gently placing her hand on his shoulder, she didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Instead, she said, "When we land," She will walk beside me. But I want you to walk behind her. I want the galaxy to see who truly carried her through fire." Mark didn't respond, he just nodded. Outside, the stars continued their silent vigil, watching as the past began to shatter, and a future none of them were prepared for slowly began to ignite. The homeworld of Veradi glittered like a living jewel beneath the wings of the returning Ark, its oceans restored with algae plasma seeding, its cities reborn with obsidian spires and sapphire domes that reached toward the sky like declarations of survival. The people had long since moved forward from war, but beneath their polished smiles and diplomatic banners, the loss of the royal child had remained an open wound in the cultural psyche. The memorial shrine for Sairaya, daughter of the House of Kareth, stood beneath the skyflower tree, a bioluminescent monument glowing over the Valley of Silence, visited daily by grieving pilgrims and whispered over by poets who never knew her. It was to this same capital city that the Ark descended, cloaked in quiet protocol and false passenger logs. There were no media drones, no council emissaries. Only the hush of anticipation felt by those ancient guards who stood on the landing platform and watched with wide eyes as the forbidden vessel touched down. When the doors opened and Queen Alcera stepped forward, no one bowed immediately. They were too stunned by what followed her. A child, alien-eyed and fragile-looking, stepped beside her, holding her hand, walking with the gait of one who had learned to move again after forgetting. Her steps were deliberate, uncertain at times, but her spine remained upright, as if some invisible string of royal memory held her tall. The palace guards stared in disbelief. The ministers gasped. The highborn attendants whispered impossible prayers. This was no clone. This was not illusion. This was her, the little girl whose portrait still hung in every council chamber as a symbol of lost innocence, now walking with the queen like morning light after years of endless dusk. Behind her came the man they had not expected, Mark Halden. No royal sash, no polished boots, no medal, just a soldier's walk, quiet and composed, his face sun-marked and sleepless, his eyes flickering with the unspoken weight of 1,000 lonely nights in the Martian dark. The guards moved to intercept him, unsure if protocol even allowed him to stand on royal ground. But Alcera raised her hand. "He walks with my name," she said, voice echoing across the ceremonial platform. "He walks as the one who carried our fire when we could not." They stepped aside. Inside the throne hall, ministers gathered rapidly. The Council of Moons, the 12 Stars of Commerce, the war-born seers, all assembled within hours as news exploded across the network in cautious streams. No one had dared imagine this. No prophecy had foreseen it. The dead child returned. And the queen who had ruled for years in frozen composure now held the girl's hand as she guided her to the foot of the great obsidian throne. Before the council could rise, before the scholars could ask questions, before the accusations of cloning or deception could begin, the child turned to them and spoke in the ancient tongue of her lineage. "I remember." That was all. But the way her voice resonated, the way the symbols etched into the floor glowed faintly beneath her bare feet, the way the air itself seemed to shudder with recognition, it silenced every doubt. Alcera stepped beside her. "This child is Sairaya of the House of Kareth. She is not artifact, not echo, not experiment. She is the blood of my blood, returned through fire and dust, rescued not by fleet nor prophecy, but by a human soldier who chose love over duty." Mark stood behind them both, saying nothing. And then something unthinkable happened. Queen Alcera turned from the throne. She looked at the man who had carried her niece from the edge of death and exile, and she did something no monarch in Veradi's long bloodline had ever done for a foreigner. She knelt, not for surrender, not for theater, but in recognition. "I cannot repay you," she said, voice thick with emotion, "but I can honor you. Let history record that the throne of Veradi bows not to power, but to the one who preserved its most fragile ember." Behind her, every minister, every noble, every soldier lowered their head, and for a moment even the banners lining the walls seemed to still. In the days that followed, the galaxy turned its gaze toward Veradi with trembling curiosity. The council sent envoys. Earth dispatched high-level representatives, some demanding answers, others offering apologies they thought might smooth over the centuries-old tensions. But Alcera ignored them all. Her time was now devoted to the girl who had returned and to the man who had brought her back. The palace schedule was rearranged, the throne room closed to outsiders. For the first time in over a decade, the queen was seen walking the outer gardens with bare feet, her niece skipping beside her, sometimes humming, sometimes silent, but always near. Mark remained within the palace walls, not as a prisoner, not as a hero, but as something far more rare, trusted. The girl would not sleep without him nearby. When nightmares returned, she would curl beside him on the great cushions provided by the royal chambermaids, her breathing easing only when she heard his voice. Sarah never interrupted these moments. She would stand by the doorway and watch, her arms crossed not in judgment but in awe. One evening, as the twin moons hung low and heavy over the capital, the child asked a simple question. "Will he stay?" Sarah looked to Mark, who did not flinch, and she answered, "If he wishes." Mark did not respond right away. He glanced at the sky, then at the girl, then at the queen whose gaze no longer burned with grief, but with a strange, fierce peace. "I stayed when no one asked me to," he said quietly. "I think I'd like to stay when I'm finally allowed." And so he did. No one replaced the girl's name on the memorial beneath the skyflower tree. They left it untouched, not to erase her death, but to remember that she had returned. In time, children of the palace would gather beneath it, laying flowers not in mourning, but in celebration of survival. The queen ruled with a steadier hand. The people sang songs of a child carried through darkness by a stranger with no crown. And Mark, once nameless and fugitive, became something else entirely, neither hero nor legend, but the quiet presence behind the flame, the shadow behind the throne. The man who proved that sometimes one life saved in silence can set 1,000 stars ablaze. And in the laughter of the girl running through the silver halls, past banners of war turned to ribbons of peace, the entire galaxy heard something ancient return. Hope.